you know, of course, that the Coast Community Library is open again with, some masking and some distancing, but they are going to begin June 11th, the special reading program and reading challenges for a lot of us in the community. And we're so happy to welcome Julia Lark and all of her staff at the Coast Community Library back. I don't know about you, Herb, but libraries have always been one of my favorite places to go. And I love the Coast Community Library. Well, they're having some sort of community reading goal, countywide community goal of 100,000 minutes between June 11th and July 23rd. And I'll tell you what, I bet between Herb and I, we could easily get a good 10,000 minutes in there somehow.
Oh, easy.
Easily. So anyway, it's a community-wide goal, and talk to Julia at 882-3114. And again, for people who are new in the community, I just keep reminding them, Herb, that they shouldn't be eating the mussels that are hanging off the rocks, because at this time of year through October, they're under quarantine. You can use them for bait, but don't eat them. That's about it. It's kind of chilly, continuing to be chilly here. I don't know how it is in your neck of the woods. It's in the mid 50s, and the winds are already at 6 miles per hour here. So, it's June. I got on my little puffy jacket. It's June at the coast. So good morning. Herb Kohl is with us. Herb is a part-time still resident of our wonderful area. He is a long-time educator, activist looking at the education community in all over the United States and the world, and has written about many ways that he thinks we can improve education. And I absolutely agree. I first met Herb through his writings decades ago when I wanted to be a teacher. And anyway, so I don't know, Herb is just wonderful. We talk with him every week. So Herb, I'm going to be quiet and give you a moment to tell us what's on your mind.
Well, you might say the last couple of days I've been lost in ancestor reverie.
Okay.
My son Josh and his wife Crony Shimura are going to New York to perform at the 35th anniversary of the New York Dance Alliance. And I told them they should go look up my cousin Adele. My cousin Adele lives in Brooklyn, and last month she turned 100.
Wow.
She was my babysitter when I was growing up. And her father, Julius, was my first political teacher. He was a delicatessen waiter, but he was also formerly a member of the Vienna Opera Choir, and as a Jew was required to leave, voluntarily left after World War I, came to New York with his sister. His mother and his mother's other daughter refused to come because they so trusted their Christian white neighbors.
Mm.
And the white neighbors eventually stood by while they were given a one-way train ticket to Auschwitz. So Adele has some very complicated stories, but she's always been one of the most bittersweet, positive people in the world. And my son's group is called the Degenerate Art Ensemble. And degenerate art is the art that the Nazis confiscated and called degenerate during their time of ascendancy. So there's a real meeting there, and I wished I could be on the wall when they met with Adele. It's interesting. Adele is continues the tradition, but the interesting thing is her father Julius. When I was a kid, when I was 10, 11, and 12, I'd go visit him at the deli in Manhattan, take a train from the Bronx and explore Manhattan and always stop in with Julius when there were no customers around. He took me in the back room and played, among other things, a bit of opera for me, Paul Robeson, and then he took out Max Eastman's translation of Das Kapital, and he explained to me what Das Kapital meant when I was 10, 11, and 12. And it reminds me how far back some of my progressive ideas were rooted in my family history and in my other grandfather's history as well. Fugitive from the Czar, who was a member of the Workmen's Circle, which is socialist, non-Zionist organization he joined in 1907. So anyway, I've been back with them because they live so strongly in my memory. And in a funny way, when things seem a little troubling, I consult with them in my imagination.
Let me
You know,
stop. Let me stop you right there, Herb. I mean, you always say so many things, and I want to hear more about your family. But that kind of having that kind of history, as we're now coming to this racial reckoning in the United States, which I must say I'm starting to see a bit even up here. I mean, well, this is where I'm at, so this is where I'm seeing it more. But the importance of our relatives and our ancestors and that history that is mainly kept in families, and why it's so important to share those histories that are often so fraught with pain. And but along with the pain, I'm always reminded is they gave us strength as well. Their strength comes with that, but the importance of sharing those stories. And as you're talking about them, why why do you think it is so important for us to share those family histories?
well, first of all, it's a matter of rooting ourselves beyond the present so that we don't just become reactive to what's happening right now. It's also understanding what's formed us, the experiences, positive or negative, that were formative in our growing up. But the other reason is to understand that we are part of history and we are makers of history, and that it is in continuity with the history that's made us. We have to make history in the present and be active in the present, understanding the weaknesses of our ancestors, but drawing especially on their strengths. And I think when you deprive a people of their knowledge of their ancestry, you are on the way to destroying them as a people. You're on your way to dehumanizing them and depersonalize them. And that's, of course, what the United States tried to do with a lot of with native communities, period, but also tried to do by the turning immigrants into good Americans, but the image of America that they were being turned into was an unrealistic, false one of white male dominance. And so it's part of the remaking of the world that I think the world has to be reborn every 20 or so years, or maybe 40 or so years. But there is a need for a rebirth of radical sensitivity on the part of all of us right now. And we have to, I know I'm involved in trying to help educate my younger relatives whose parents have shied away from talking about their own history. And I'm a receptacle, you might say. I'm second elder alive in my family after Adele. And so I have begun to take it on as a greater responsibility. And I always still consider myself a junior high kid. So, I, you know, so funny to feel both an elder and a youngster at the same time.
Isn't that the truth? And I'm a bit younger, and I have to tell you this brief aside about elder. I was with Eric Wilder over the weekend. Susan and I went up to Kashaya. I'm going to be interviewing a young Native scholar whose book I think you'd like to read. It's about Richard Oakes, but it's also about the history of the sovereignty movement and the difference between that and, say, the Young Lords or AIM or other things. Anyway, it's very interesting, very scholarly book. But I wanted to go up for Eric to show us at Kashaya where Richard Oakes was murdered and some other things that had happened at Kashaya. So anyway, the place we went to was and still is a Christian campground. And as we got there, we checked in and the man helping us had a little badge on. He had a little badge and it said Elder Stevenson or something like that. And I said, wow, we should have our little badges too. You could be Elder Kohl and I can be, of course, Susan said I could be Elder Barry, but,
Right.
but wear our little badges of eldership. And because that means, I mean, we're teasing about it, but having earned that right, I mean, there are people who get old, but they're not necessarily elders, and but having earned that right, I think to be an elder is something that should be revered and respected among all cultures. Anyway, I just got a kick out of that badge. Let's wear our elder badge from now on.
Right. It's funny because added to all of that, one of my closest friends who died recently was one of the founders of the Young Lords, Luis Gardner Costa. And he was working at that hospital.
Oh,
I was talking about.
That was a great show today, yes.
And Luis was very central to that whole event, and created with his wife Frances Lucerna El Puente in Williamsburg, one of the more extraordinary community education programs I've ever seen in my life.
Williamsburg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Williamsburg was, it's a funny, the Williamsburg where Luis lived in and El Puente was at its height in was Puerto Rican, Dominican, Orthodox Jewish, and old-timey Polish. And El Puente was in an old church there, and it was an education community that had, for example, a theater group called the Toxic Avengers. And the Toxic Avengers would wear masks and all, and they went out and they forced New York to clean up a toxic dump site in there. And they went in as superheroes. and they closed down the Williamsburg Bridge at one point. Well, now the community, unfortunately, from my point of view, is white gentrified to the point of pushing out the Puerto Rican and Dominican community. You know, they discovered that those abandoned factories in Williamsburg, facing on the East River, had on the second floor and above a skyline view of Manhattan. So
Mm-hmm.
they've been totally gentrified. The first wave of artists and young runaways went through that, and the second wave was real estate agents. And so Williamsburg now is a very gentrified community, and basically most of the El Puente community has been dissipated.
Hmm.
Again, something that, for example, as an elder, I can tell that story as a warning to other people who are trying to build communities, that there are people sitting waiting to steal the work that they're doing to create a human culture in order to create a mercenary capitalist culture. So knowing that history is very, very important.
Wow, you again, so many things that we could talk about in that, and you brought up something that is so important, and it's getting lost in all of the conversation today about how billionaires don't pay taxes, and we talk about COVID reopenings, and I want to talk about that and about yourself personally, but people saying, well, restaurants say they don't have any workers. Well, why don't they have any workers? Because of the real estate. Who can afford to live in the communities? We're seeing that right here in our backyards. Where are the CNAs for the hospice going to come from? Where are the restaurant workers? Where are all those service people? They don't have any place to live in this community anymore.
And the same real estate people who are complaining drove out the unions.
Mm-hmm.
So that a living wage job, my uncle, who I was telling you about, he was one of the founders of the Restaurant Workers Union.
Julius.
Yeah, Julius was one of the
Wow.
founders from his little deli. It's not his deli, but the deli where he was a waiter. He worked as an organizer with other people in the restaurant industry to organize the Restaurant Workers Union. And it's funny, Adele's husband was an organizer of the Pharmacists Union. And their children didn't know about that till I had to spend some time telling them about the honorable, wonderful things their parents and grandparents did. You know, the erasing of memory, not only it cuts family ties and it cuts communities ties, and that's all part of predatory capitalism. You should have no past, you should have no roots, you should have no rights and no unions. And then they complain they can't find workers. Who wants to work for them? Is the way I know my grandfather would say. I'll only work for a good boss who pays a good wage with good benefits, but I'd rather own the company.
Hmm.
Anyway.
That last phrase, I'd rather own the company, is something we don't hear much. It's time for me to remind you, you're listening to Peggy's Place this morning on KGUA, and we're talking with Herb Kohl, and Herb, who is so full of history and energy, and did a lot of his work in writing on education and how there are better ways to educate people than the current systems we have. But he's always educating us. And today we started talking about about Herb's family history and the importance of being in touch with his elders. So we've gotten off in that history here in the United States and how it has been so suppressed, and all people's histories and cultures because of this whole concept. And we don't use these terms anymore, but it used to be the melting pot, or I don't know, then it got into ridiculous things like salads and all. But anyway, the that in order for this country to become one whole, we had to just put aside, as you're referring to this, the capitalist desire to just keep us all as one, just in time and going forward, but there being no past and no reason why we're where we're at, I guess, to simplify it.
Well, having gone to Harvard from the Bronx, I realized that the people who really ruled this country wanted there to be a melting pot for them, so long as they could continue to rule and have the spoon that mixed the pot. In other words, they didn't want to be in the pot. They just wanted to control the contents of the pot. So it's funny, the myth makers, the Harvard elite and all, were not at all, and it really struck me, didn't really believe in people's democracy. And coming from a union left-wing family in the Bronx, working class community, it was like I was living on a foreign land because the values were so different. And you could really feel the presence of people who were working to destroy the myth, who benefited from the myth of everyone in America being equal by themselves being unequal to everybody who's equal. And I think we never forget that when they start preaching, oh, make America great again and all the rest of that nonsense, they don't mean it for them. They mean we want to rule it and we will make America what benefits us. And I think that one of the things we all need to be aware of is that there are, and I think the Congress has been demonstrating that there are people in the United States with real power who do not believe in democracy, who basically fundamentally would destroy the democracy that we have so painfully almost achieved. And so don't ever be fooled by the fact that the Republicans, for example, will talk about democratic America and democracy. They don't believe in it. They really would discard it like old rags once they were in a position to do that, and which is what they're trying to do right now.
I find myself in this weird place a couple of weeks ago rooting for Liz Cheney.
Yeah,
when did I ever think that would happen? And this morning I was watching the news, and the partner of the policeman who was murdered, Stickler, I think that was his name. Anyway, she is also a Republican. He was a staunch Trump supporter, but here she was saying on TV this morning about how Donald Trump should be held responsible, and all of those people in Congress who are Republicans who are denying all of this. And all I could think was, oh, I hope she runs for office. We need that kind of Republican. And I catch myself thinking these kinds of things, and it's like, wait a minute. But
That's right.
but things are so terribly upside down.
Well,
And
you see, you
go
see,
ahead.
that's how easy it is to trick you into forgetting history.
Right, right. I'm just shocked when my brain immediately pops up. Oh, let's get that woman there and clean up house. But the history of the Republicans, was it always meant to destroy democracy as we know it, or is this a recent history of the Republican Party?
No, I think it was, well, the first election I was actively engaged in when I was in high school was um, Adlai Stevenson's campaign. And the Republicans then were criticizing Adlai Stevenson for believing in too much democracy. That's what they were complaining about. The Democrats represent too much democracy, which really is the motto of the Republican Party. Don't have too much, just have enough to let people talk about it. But too much democracy is a negation of the principles of the Republican Party, the
And
principles of capitalism.
isn't that part of why our education system is the way it is?
Unfortunately, yes. I'm a bit of a historian of the progressive education movement in the United States. And in the 1930s and 40s, the Progressive Education Association, along with a lot of students of John Dewey's and other people, were very, very progressive public school advocates. There were some wonderful schools like Benjamin Franklin High School in Manhattan. I can name all over the country. The National Association of Manufacturers mounted an effort highly funded to discredit the Progressive Education Association and destroy it. So they felt that progressive, decent, open, creative, democratic education was enough of a danger for the business community to fund the destruction of that. And one of the things they're doing now, by the way, on the right, is funding endowed chairs at universities for right wing academics to destroy whatever critical theory and thinking exists right now. Same thing in education.
Mm.
So the Republican Party has a long, long history of being anti democratic. They never had a desire to believe in majority rule. They had a desire to have, as Reagan said, a permanent Republican majority. And that's what they're working on now in Congress, a permanent Republican majority.
Okay.
Unfortunately for them, that's not viable because, according to them, there are just too many brown and black people growing up, too many radical young people. In other words, demographics is against them. So that they have to become more and more demagogues and more dictators, kind of supporting of authoritarianism, because they're losing the potential of a popular vote.
Right. Well, I think that's what we have to talk about next. And again, I want to remind people, if you just tuned in, you're listening to Herb Kohl, who is a educator, prolific writer, wonderful historian, and comes and joins us the third Wednesday, second, what is this? Second Wednesday of every
Every month.
month
Yes.
here on KGUA on Peggy's Place. And, bringing his history and his analysis, which you may or may not agree with, that's fine. But this analysis that we don't hear, to be able to look at what's going on historically and what's going on right now. And we just got to the point of talking about voter suppression again.
You're right. And about the need for voting rights drives community by community because of the disenfranchisement of poor people and people of color. And that's a battle that Highlander Center was involved in the 60s, starting in the 50s. And that was a battle that the feminist suffragette movement was involved in the 20s and the 30s. So if you take a look at the history, the struggle to create a democracy and the struggle to widen the voting rolls went hand in hand. And so now there's a retrograde attempt to undo the victories, including the victories from the feminist movement, from the suffragettes, from the civil rights movement, from the union movement. These are all forces that are pro-democratic. And there's a lot of money in the anti-democratic camp, you know?
I heard a story on one of our science shows about the use of geometry, of math, in looking at gerrymandering and redistricting. A lot of money going into math. And it's something that we ignore a bit. We sort of, some of us may have an idea of what we think gerrymandering is and all of that. But with these scientists, mathematical scientists, looking specifically at the demographics, knowing that, well, we already have 60% of the vote here. That's all we need to win. So we're going to draw the lines so that we move 40% over here where we need those 40% of the voters over here. Anyway, doing the math in all the surrounding areas to make sure that they get at least the 60% majority. I was astounded. I'd never thought of.
Well, they're building algorithms that'll allow them to do that.
Yep.
So that you can punch in all the data and they'll come up with alternatives that give you the maximum opportunities for them to disenfranchise or overcome other populist votes, absolutely. And it's not going to get easier. On the other hand, I advocate for radical people from Silicon Valley to come in and destroy those algorithms and create new uses of technology for progress. And there are people who are doing that. And I have some former students who are actually engaged in educating activists as programmers to do demographics and to do geographic studies. It's what's interesting at the university is the geography department is now the center of a lot of the most creative activity. Because the drawing of maps on a global scale is major political activity. So if you're looking for the radicals and the reactionaries, look to the geography department more than most anywhere else.
Interesting. Absolutely. It makes a whole lot of sense. And it's an area that unless you really love that, you would ignore, right?
What?
I said that's an area where a lot of students and people would ignore because it sounds, but political science, we'll go study political science, or we'll go study anything but geology,
But
geography.
but the interesting thing is geography is a combination of geopolitics, that is the question of, but it's not the question of nations, it's the question of boundaries, resources, allocation of resources, domination of resources, international trade, flow of materials back and forth. All of this now is in the lap of the geographers, interestingly enough, many of whom are also sociologists, historians, computer technicians. And I learned this actually by being privileged to follow my daughter Erica's studies when she was getting her doctorate at Cal. And she was saying, oh no, the geography department is where all these creative people were. And I remembered back to my geography book in junior high school. That's not what they're talking about.
Right.
That's not what they're talking about.
Wow. Erica may be listening. She tries to listen every time you're on. So,
by the way, in terms of the ancestors,
yes,
Erica has now taken over the Center for the Coastal Ridge Research and Education Center, which I founded in Point Arena. And I've withdrawn from that, and she's now the director.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations, Erica. I should have her on one of these days. Should have both of you on at the same time.
Next time we're up there together, we'll give you a heads up, okay?
That would be great. That would be great. Well, speaking of history and being together, how does all of this, we've been talking on the larger geopolitical map arena, how does it affect communities like ours, Herb, where you lived for so long? How does it all trickle down to here, and what does it mean in places like this?
Well, for example, the demographics of populations in Point Arena, since when I was there, I would say on the voting rolls was probably 10% Latino. It's now probably 65% Latino. There is an untapped political struggle in Point Arena and in Mendocino coming from the new Latino community. They're going to have political and economic power. And unless you consider geography, demographic, because that has to do with immigration, with migration, it has to do with who is beginning to own the small businesses. In other words, all of this affects Mendocino County and Point Arena and Gualala. And if you look at it in a long-term geographic sense, the connection of those communities internationally and nationally because of technology changes the way in which those communities can function. Because you don't have to just function locally. You want to organize something in Point Arena, but you can be part of computer networks that take you all over the world. So you'll get, for example, some right now fugitives from Silicon Valley are buying and creating small communities up in Mendocino, but those are computer-based communities that bring their income with them because of the computer demographics and their capacity to work remotely. So that's how it affects. It's going to affect everything and everybody. The demographic, geographic, and technological changes are what everybody is living on an everyday basis right now.
Oh, wow. You just reminded me of, oh my gosh, in the early 80s, when I worked for the Seventh Generation Fund, and we had a newspaper called Native Self-Sufficiency, which we laid out on old Mac SEs, those little screens. And but we talked about this change. At that point, desktop publishing was the big thing. And people all over Sebastopol and, Sonoma County and Mendocino County were starting to come into this area, but it was all about desktop publishing. Now we jump all these decades later into another century, actually, and the way it's taking root now, I think that's a really good way to look at it, even
Yes.
though we still could, use some much more infrastructure. And so you're getting some elite workers here, who have the money to actually tap into fiber, which we don't. We see the fiber, it's 70 feet away from our home, and we can't tap into it because it costs a lot of money. We have neighbors up the road I've never seen, but they're working for a big company. But my point is back to infrastructure needs of broadband. And then I keep going back, though, to the inability to stay living here because of the real estate market.
That's right. That's right.
That's a big
And
concern.
those we, I think one of the things that I'd like to do in the next so often is draw up a list of the contradictions that exist currently in the Mendocino, in the Gualala Point Arena area. Economic contradictions, cultural contradictions in the, heaven forbid to say it, in the Marxian sense, in the sense of social and economic contradictions that lead to conflict and that are ongoing and that will at one point need some kind of synthesis. And then see if we can put together some workshop. Erica and her colleagues and friends and all are kind of pushing me to want to jump in again,
Good.
I've had enough rest. You might say I'm not really resting, but I've had enough rest, and it's taken me a long time to come to terms with my wife's death from Alzheimer's, since I lived through the whole thing with her, and I kept her at home and lived with her till the last moment. It's taken me a while to both incorporate that and come alive again.
Mhm.
I didn't die, but it was very difficult, since we've been married 53 years. But it means all of these young people who are becoming aware now will inspire us elders to remember what we were like when we were most active. And that's really very healthy for us in terms of living and in terms of contributions. And so at this point, I'm feeling very inspired and angry in a good way.
Mhm.
My rage is being focused and tempered in a proper manner. When your rage is not focused, you go to riot. But when your rage is focus, you go to organize and to create something decent.
Well, that is one of the many lessons of becoming elder is that you can get look back on that. Well, I can see that in your face, and I you know, I see you wearing your wedding ring, and yes, you know, and your beloved Judy was an amazing person, an amazing person. And so for you to, it's normal, it's natural to have to go through that catharsis.
Sure.
But to see you coming out to the other side, because there's a need for you. Frankly, we need you. We need your wisdom and visions, and they do have to be tempered with. You need a certain amount of anger. I remember when I was a very young and dysfunctional person, and I thought, boy, if I ever lose my anger, I'll be no good to my people. And, you know, that was, of course, not true. But a good, healthy anger is important, but not just, as you say, going to riot and self-ruin, you know,
That's
uh,
right.
as well. I think we are seeing a lot more across the nation. Of course, you and I are concerned about not only the nation, but what goes on in our own backyards, and what we're seeing going on. And it's just, you know, it's very hard to watch the national news because they focus on only a couple of things.
Right.
And you'd never get the full picture of what's going on. So in our community, I think it's important to let our community know you have a role, you have a destiny here. Yeah, you
That's
do
right.
have a part in all of this that's going on around, and can make a lot of difference.
That's right. And that in some ways, by doing that, you are also not alone because there are hundreds of communities like this fighting the similar struggles, not in the exact same way, but in their own ways that are similar enough that they are comrades in the struggle for decency. The word that I find myself using more and more because of Trump and what they created is decency, because they are indecent. Obscene is the appropriate way to describe their behavior. And that to be a decent human being is to fight for social, economic, and cultural justice. It's just the decent thing to do, is the way I like to put it to my students when I was teaching.
As you will continue to be teaching, and as you teach us every time you're on KGUA, you're listening to Herb Kohl, who's teaching us all now and reminding us of all why it's so important uh, to work and strive for, as just using your word, a decent world, decent treatment of each other, decent world, and education. The other piece of this, Herb, we only have a few minutes left here, is the part that is affecting everything in ways faster than we ever expected, and that's the climate
Yes,
situation.
absolutely. Absolutely. The universe is overtaking us. And you have to be humble and pay attention and do what we can with forces that I tend to believe are more powerful than human forces. That the climate is not only global, but probably a galaxy-wide phenomena. I keep on, it's very exciting to me, all of the interactions that are not visible to our senses, but are affecting our being, are becoming revealed through science, through poetry, through other things. And as the universe is unveiled, we have to become much more humble and much more decent and much understand how to place oneself in a properly non-arrogant role vis-a-vis the universe. And it's a good challenge. you know, I keep on thinking, when I was growing up, there was always someone, when you get ultra serious, someone would make a Yiddish joke. And the Yiddish joke basically is a joke of, so you think things are bad, they could be worse.
Right.
And so when things seem real down, I remember the things that my ancestors went through to make it possible for me and my family to be here, live and act decently, and to laugh a bit. I think if you can't make a decent joke, you've lost it.
That's people are often surprised when they're around Indians because we laugh a lot. We laugh and tease a lot. Sometimes it's self-deprecating. Sometimes you're really teasing somebody, and you got to be. You can't have thin skin because that's just the way our world is. And through all of the history, current, past, current, whatever, we laugh a lot. And I did a documentary many decades ago at this Native Women's Health Conference, and the number one comment was, "I've never heard Indians laughing so much," and people were shocked. It's like, of course we're laughing. But you're right. You have to have that. Otherwise, what a sad, depressing place you would be in.
That's right.
And that does happen.
And laughter with someone else is a form of solidarity.
Yes,
You
yes.
know?
Well,
It's like,
even animals joke with each other and tease
yes,
with each other.
yes, indeed. My totem animal, which is the raven, talk about joking and trickster animals, you know?
I
Yeah.
have to say, my least favorite bird.
What?
That's my least favorite bird.
Well,
I mean,
I guess part of the reason for me with the raven is, first of all, they couple for life.
yes.
And second of all, they love to play in the air and drop sticks to each other and play around. And there have been so many stories about tricksters that are raven stories that in Point Arena you can see them.
Mm-hmm.
And Judy and I used to adopt a couple up by the lighthouse. You could see them up there every day probably. And it was just a connection.
Yeah, I let me clarify that they are wonderful and so intelligent, and yes, they do like to play, and they are cunning. A couple is fine. When we ended up with like 60, that was not fun, and not,
No.
that's
But
because we had a feeder in our area.
You what?
We had a feeder, somebody who was
Really?
feeding them, and so we
Throwing out,
literally.
throwing out carcasses?
Oh, you can car? No, I don't know what they were just there. They were literally, we had 60 within the few trees, not the few trees, but within the trees around us. That got to be a bit much. But yes,
I agree.
for their, as you say, they have a lot to offer and are used as teachers, as we know in many cultures.
But there are all kinds of things we can learn from the natural world, and there's all kinds of underestimation of the communication and intelligence of animals on the part of the white Western world. So, for example, you have to study whether dogs have feelings. That means you've never had a dog, you know,
Right.
or
Right.
means, which is more like a lot of white people, you've had a dog, but you've never noticed that they've had feelings. And so you act as if they don't have feelings when it's convenient to you. That's the same way you treat, that's what colonialism is all about. I love to kind of move in and out of the mini politics, medium politics, global. I'm not up to the universe yet. It's too complicated for me.
Oh, Herb, I love talking. We just have a couple of minutes left, but the universe has a sense of humor too, and that's I think
Yes.
that's why we're all here to, as humans, partly part of that humorous mistake. I don't know. We can offer so much, and then we also like, oh, those pitiful humans. Look at them. But you're right, and obviously the teachings that were instilled in me from my family and our history, and I am, very much a contemporary, what's known as a first generation urban Indian. So never, I am not a shaman or shaw woman or anything like that, but those lessons that are so universal, that we are all part of this, we are all one, and everything has an intelligence to it, whether we can measure it, quantify it or not. It's there, and keeping things in balance, that's supposed to be our job. And right now we're so out of balance everywhere. I don't know how we get back into that balance, but I'm going to give you the last 30 seconds, Herb. That's it.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, the last 30 seconds is everybody who is a bit of an elder should look to get to know people between the ages of 18 and 24 that they do not currently know in their own communities, and see what they can learn from them. In other words, it's up to us elders to connect with the young. We don't wait around for them to connect with us, but it's also a privilege.
Mhm.
It's a privilege to support the dreams of fantasies and occasionally the not vicious trouble that young people get into.
Okay,
Because that's it.
that's it. That's it. I'm sorry, Herb. We're out of time.
That's okay.
All right. Thank you, Herb. Always great to see you, and I can't wait to see you up here again too.
You will. Okay.
All right, Herb Kohl. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, Peggy here at KG